Nobody in Chicago said no to Grayson Calloway. At 33, he ran the most powerful family empire in the city, the kind of man whose name made grown men lower their voices, whose silence was more frightening than anyone else's threats. So when 300 guests filled the Calloway estate to watch him place a ring onto the finger of Camille Hastings, the billionaire heiress his family had picked out for him, everyone knew exactly how the night would end. Except it didn't, because in front of the most powerful people in that city, Grayson set the ring box down, walked straight past his stunned bride-to-be, and stopped in front of a woman. The whole estate walked past every day, as if she wasn't even there. The 27-year-old nurse who cared for his ailing mother, a widowed single mom. Then the most feared man in Chicago lowered himself onto one knee and offered her his hand. The ballroom went dead silent, but what shocked everyone even more was what happened next. The quiet nurse looked him in the eye, said no, and walked away, leaving the most powerful man in the city kneeling alone. Why he did it, and why she turned him down, nobody could understand. Even his mother, the frail woman sitting in the corner of that room, wouldn't fully understand until the day of their real wedding years later. And what she said in that church left everyone who heard it in tears. If this story touches your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's go back to where it all began, on the night of the engagement party that changed everything. The late autumn wind sweeping in from Lake Michigan lashed against the windows of the Calloway mansion, cold enough to make people pull their coats tighter around themselves as they stepped out of their cars. But inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of fresh flowers and floor wax. The unmistakable smell of an evening prepared so carefully that nothing could be allowed to go wrong. Tessa Merrick didn't enter through the front door. She took the back staircase, the narrow one reserved for the staff, its wooden steps creaking softly beneath the worn soles of her shoes as she carried a tray of evening medication, a glass of warm water, and a blood pressure monitor. Her hands held the tray perfectly steady, the kind of steadiness found only in someone who had carried thousands of trays just like it. Her fingers calloused exactly where calluses belonged, her nails clipped short, bare of rings and polish, her skin dry from washing her hands too many times each day. She had just finished her shift at the nursing home across the city, eaten a sandwich in a hurry on the bus, and now she was beginning her second shift, the one with Maeve. At the stair landing, she stopped for a moment to catch her breath and glanced at her phone screen, which had a crack running diagonally from one corner, and behind that fracture was the face of a little girl grinning proudly, showing the gap where one of her front teeth had just fallen out. Tessa looked at the picture for perhaps 2 seconds, then turned the phone face down in her palm, the way someone might cup a hand over a candle to keep the wind from blowing it out. Then she knocked on the door. The room at the end of the third-floor hallway was a room everyone in the mansion knew existed, and also a room almost no one wanted to enter. It smelled of medicine, the humidifier murmured steadily, and inside was a woman whose illness had taken away most of the control she once had over her own hands. Maeve Calloway sat propped against her pillows, her eyes fixed on the window, where the garden lights below were coming on row by row for the party. She didn't turn around. She only said that downstairs they were decorating as though they were preparing to receive a king. Tessa set the tray down, checked each packet of medication in the proper order, took Maeve's blood pressure, and recorded the reading in the small notebook the home care company required its nurses to complete during every shift. The company that had sent her here under a contract signed by Maeve herself, not by her son, and not by anyone else in this house. When she finished, she didn't leave right away. She pulled a chair closer, reached into her cloth bag, and took out 2 knitting needles and a ball of pale gray yarn. Maeve shook her head and said wearily that she couldn't do it anymore, that these days her hands were only good at dropping things. Tessa didn't argue. She simply placed the knitting needles in Maeve's palms, then supported the older woman's wrists from underneath with her own hands, holding them gently, just firmly enough to keep the trembling from carrying the entire arm away. Maeve tried 1 stitch, and the yarn slipped free. She tried a second, and it slipped again. On the 3rd attempt, the yarn caught around the needle and stayed there, and Maeve stared at that crooked little stitch for a long time, as though she had just seen the face of someone she once knew. She said she had stopped knitting the winter she was diagnosed, not because it hurt, but because one evening she had dropped an entire ball of yarn in the living room in front of her husband's guests, and from that day forward, she hadn't wanted anyone to see her hands again. Tessa told her that an ugly stitch was still a stitch, and that no one in that room was grading her. Maeve remained silent for a long while, then said very softly that everyone in this house spent money to keep her alive longer, but Tessa was the only one who made her want to keep living. Tessa didn't answer. She only bent down to retrieve the ball of yarn that had rolled beneath the bed, and while her face was lowered, she managed to hide the blink that lasted just a little too long. Maeve missed nothing. She had seen Tessa glance at her phone before turning it face down on the table, the gesture of someone carrying a piece of news in her pocket that she hadn't yet found the courage to open. And she had also seen Tessa check the time twice in half an hour, the look of a person counting down the minutes until she could return home. Maeve didn't ask. At her age, she had learned that some doors only opened when the people behind them chose to turn the handle themselves. In Tessa's small apartment across the city, tucked inside the drawer of her nightstand, there was an old phone she hadn't used in a long time, and she still plugged it in to charge once every month. When Tessa went down to the kitchen to return the tray, she overheard part of a whispered conversation between two servers arranging glasses. They said that tonight, before the rings were exchanged, the future lady of the house would personally go up to the 3rd floor to visit the old woman, and a photographer would be coming with her. The other server asked a brief question, and both of them fell silent the moment they saw Tessa enter. That silence wasn't the silence of people caught speaking cruelly behind someone's back. It was more like the silence of people who had accidentally warned someone that something terrible was about to happen. At the very moment Tessa set the tray beside the kitchen sink, in a neighborhood on the west side of the city, a man named Ruiz was opening the door to his apartment, with a suitcase rolling behind him, and he froze on the threshold because someone was already sitting in his darkened living room. Grayson Calloway sat in the armchair facing the entrance, both hands resting on the arms of the chair, his coat still buttoned, the lights off, and no one standing behind him. He didn't rise when Ruiz came in. He only tilted his chin slightly toward the empty chair on the other side of the table, and Ruiz sat down like a man whose own legs had betrayed him. On the table between them lay a stack of printed documents, pages of financial statements arranged with perfect neatness, and on top of them was the one-way airline ticket Ruiz had booked that morning. Grayson didn't mention any of the numbers on those pages. In a calm, even voice, the kind people used to read the weather forecast, he said Ruiz had two choices. The first was that tomorrow he would arrive at work on time, just as he always did, repay every dollar he had taken according to the schedule the accountants would provide, and continue working until the balance reached zero. The second was that he could go to the airport tonight, and tomorrow morning, in whatever city he landed, no bank would approve him for a loan, no employer would sign a contract with him, and no one would answer the phone when he called the names of his old friends. Ruiz reached for the glass of water on the table, and his hand trembled so badly that he knocked it over, sending water spreading across the wood and soaking into the edge of the papers. Neither man moved to wipe it up. Grayson stood, straightened his cuff, and said that he had never needed to make anyone bleed. He only made people wish they had never betrayed him. Ruiz managed to say exactly one thing, that he chose the first option. Grayson had already reached the door when he turned back and told Ruiz to wipe up the water before it ruined the floor, then closed the door behind him with extraordinary gentleness. On the drive back to the mansion, Cormac Calloway sat beside his nephew, slowly turning the ring on his little finger, and said that tonight nothing could be allowed to stray from the script. He reminded Grayson that the Hastings family wasn't a family, it was a doorway, and once the Calloways stepped through it, their name would be spoken on the trading floor instead of in investigations. Port contracts would be signed in broad daylight, and the children who carried that name afterward would never have to explain their grandfather to anyone. He said that was what Grayson's father had wanted throughout his final years, the thing he hadn't lived long enough to accomplish. Grayson looked through the window at the city lights sliding past and said nothing. He still remembered that promise, spoken beside his father's deathbed, so brief that it had barely lasted a single breath. What he didn't tell his uncle was that for several weeks now, one small thing had lingered in his mind, something he couldn't explain. His mother had begun to laugh again. Not the polite laugh she offered when guests were present. Real laughter, drifting out from the room on the 3rd floor, a sound he had believed this house had lost a long time ago. He knew exactly where it had begun. It had begun on the evening he summoned the private physician after being told that his mother had remained awake for 2 nights, and he ordered the doctor to increase her sedative dosage so she could sleep. The doctor had been there, along with Bridget, the housekeeper, 2 members of the staff, and the new nurse standing beside the bed. The doctor had barely opened his case when she said no. She didn't circle around the matter or soften the words before speaking them. She said she followed medical orders, not personal commands, and that the dosage Grayson requested wasn't part of that day's treatment plan. He still remembered asking her, very quietly, whether she knew who she was speaking to, and she had answered that his mother needed waking hours in order to remain a human being, not to be kept asleep because it was more convenient for everyone else. The entire room held its breath. Bridget closed her eyes. The younger servant stepped completely behind the doctor. Everyone waited to hear the sentence that people in that house heard only once in a lifetime. Grayson stood there in silence for exactly 3 breaths, looking at the woman who had placed herself between him and the bed, her arms resting at her sides, her back straight, her eyes refusing to turn away. Then he gave a single nod and walked out of the room. He couldn't sleep that night, not because he was angry, but because in the empire he had built, it was the first time anyone had ever told him no without trembling. The car turned through the mansion gates, the lights stretching along the driveway, and Cormac said that nearly all the guests had arrived. Camille Hastings came up to the 3rd floor about half an hour before the ring ceremony, preceded by an assistant carrying a makeup bag and followed by 2 people from a magazine, one holding a camera and the other carrying a light. The door opened, and the room that had held nothing but the quiet hum of the humidifier was suddenly crowded with people. Camille sat on the edge of the bed, took Maeve's hand in both of hers, leaned her head close to the older woman's shoulder, and in the instant the camera was raised, her face became so beautiful that no one could have found a single thing to criticize. She spoke in phrases just loud enough for everyone to hear, saying that she hoped to call Maeve mother, and that she would care for her as though she were her own daughter. Maeve left her hand resting inside Camille's. She didn't pull it away, but she didn't squeeze back either. Tessa stood tucked into the corner beside the small cabinet, still holding the care log in one hand, her eyes lowered to the floor. The flash went off several times. The photographer said they had enough. The crew stepped into the hallway to pack away their equipment, the door closing behind them, and the moment their footsteps began to fade, Camille's hands released Maeve's. She stood, brushed lightly at the skirt of her dress, then turned to Tessa and said that beginning tomorrow, she would change into the uniform worn by the household staff, the pale gray one, because that stark white nursing outfit didn't match the color scheme of the mansion when guests were present. Tessa looked up. Camille didn't wait for her to respond. She turned and surveyed the room once more, taking in the humidifier, the medication tray, the newly installed handrail running along the wall, then continued in a voice as light as though she were discussing a change of curtains, saying that after the wedding, everything would be arranged in a more sensible way. Her mother-in-law would be moved to a proper care facility, one with doctors on duty around the clock and gardens to walk through, and then the mansion would no longer carry that faint medicinal smell through every floor. Maeve said nothing. She only turned her gaze toward the window, and Tessa saw both of her hands clenched together on top of the blanket, tightening until even the trembling was forced to stop. Tessa heard her own voice before she had time to consider the consequences. She said, "Miss Hastings, she's a mother, not an old piece of furniture for you to move away because it doesn't match the curtains." The words fell into the center of the room and stayed there. Camille turned fully toward her, looked her over from head to toe, then smiled with such sweetness that anyone seeing only a photograph would have assumed the 2 women had just exchanged something pleasant. She said that Tessa had just written her own letter of resignation. Then she walked out, adjusting her necklace as she passed the mirror. What neither woman in the room knew was that the door leading into the hallway had already been left slightly open, and Grayson had been standing outside since the photography crew withdrew. He had come upstairs to escort his mother down to the main hall according to the schedule. He heard everything from beginning to end, without missing a single word, and he didn't enter. Inside his mind, the pieces rearranged themselves with great speed and terrible coldness, exactly the way they always did. If he opened the door now, the 300 people downstairs would have a story to tell for the rest of the year, and the Hastings family would smell the fracture before the ink on the contract had time to dry. Everything had its appointed hour. He would allow the evening to unfold exactly according to the script. The contract would be signed, the guests would leave, and then everything would be handled in silence, without spectacle and without witnesses. He stepped back, took out his phone, and sent his private assistant a single line, instructing them to prepare every possible way of ending the engagement without giving a single newspaper anything worth printing, and to send it to him before morning. Then he put the phone away, straightened his cuff, and knocked on the door as though he had only just arrived. At the far end of the hallway, Camille stopped beside the window and called the home care agency. She gave her name, said she was the fiancée of the owner of the house, and demanded that the nurse assigned to the evening shift at that address be replaced. The person on the other end remained silent for a moment, then replied with great politeness that they were very sorry, but the contract had been signed by the client herself, and the client had clearly requested that the assigned caregiver remain unchanged, so the company couldn't make any substitution without written authorization from the person who had signed it. Camille asked again, more slowly this time, and received exactly the same answer. She ended the call. She stood there for several more seconds, looking down at the courtyard filled with cars and lights, and something in her eyes changed. Maeve entered the main hall in her wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap around a small velvet box worn at the corners. Inside was the emerald brooch her own mother-in-law had pinned to her dress on her wedding day, and by the custom of this family, it was to be passed on to the new daughter-in-law after the ring ceremony. She placed the box on a small table set against the wall in the private sitting room beside the grand hall, a room used only by members of the household, then left it there and was wheeled out to greet the guests. About half an hour later, when the music had softened into a slow peace and people had begun gathering around the long tables of wine, Camille entered the private sitting room, and an hour after that she emerged wearing the expression of someone who had discovered something deeply uncomfortable. She didn't cry out. She went to Cormac, spoke a few quiet words to him, then turned toward the crowd and said in a calm, measured voice that a family heirloom was no longer where it had been placed, and she sincerely hoped everyone would remain calm, because surely it was only a misunderstanding. It was that gentle voice that silenced the hall faster than any shout could have done. Camille continued by saying that, for the sake of clarity, and so none of their honored guests would suffer an unjust suspicion, she proposed that they inspect the staff area first, politely, with members of the family present, and anyone else who wished to witness it. No one objected to a request spoken so courteously. The group moved toward the back corridor, a passage that, for the first time that evening, received the polished leather shoes of the wealthy. The staff lockers were opened one by one. At the fourth locker, someone pulled out a faded cloth coat hanging inside, and from its right pocket the brooch fell into Cormac's palm, the emerald catching the corridor light and flashing with cruel brilliance. A strip of tape on the locker door bore the name Tessa Merrick. Tessa stood at the end of the hallway with an empty tray in her hands. She looked at the brooch, then at her own coat, and she understood immediately. She understood completely. She understood all the way to the deepest part of herself what had just been done to her. But understanding was one thing, and she had nothing in her hands. No one had seen anything. No one had been standing beside her at the time, and that coat had hung there since the beginning of the evening. Whispers began rising behind the crowd, sharper than any direct accusation. Someone said she was a single mother, raising a child alone. Someone else said they had heard the little girl was sick with something, and who could possibly afford hospital bills like that? Another voice, softer than all the others, said that in circumstances like hers, how could anyone truly blame her? It was that remark, the one that sounded almost like pity, that cut the deepest, because it didn't accuse her. It simply accepted her theft as something natural and inevitable. Cormac asked whether she had anything to say. Camille stood slightly behind him, with her arms folded across her chest, her face carrying exactly the right measure of sorrow for someone forced into an unfortunate situation against her will. Tessa lowered the tray onto the top of the locker, slowly, carefully, without allowing it to make a sound. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. Didn't say that she hadn't taken it. Didn't point at anyone, because she knew that in this room, her word carried exactly as much weight as the uniform she wore. She only straightened her back, looked directly at Cormac, and said that she was poor, but her daughter had never once been forced to lower her eyes in shame because of her mother, and today would be no different. Then she fell silent. That silence lasted long enough for several people in the crowd to begin feeling uneasy, without understanding why. Maeve, behind them, tried to press her hands against the rims of her wheelchair to move forward, but her hands trembled too badly, and the chair advanced only a little. And in the corner of the corridor, where the light fell weakest, Bridget Doyle, the housekeeper who had served this home so long that she knew the creak of every stair, quietly set down the tray she was holding and stepped forward. Bridget Doyle took another step forward, and then another, until she stood directly beneath the corridor light, and she said that she had something to say. The entire crowd turned to look at the silver-haired woman in the housekeeper's uniform, worn pale at the elbows. The woman everyone had passed throughout the evening without truly seeing. She said that about an hour earlier, while checking the spare napkins in the linen closet at the end of the corridor, she had seen someone enter the staff area, and that person wasn't a member of the household staff. She said she remembered it clearly because the woman had been walking very quickly and carrying a velvet box in her hand. Bridget turned her head and looked directly at the young woman standing partly hidden behind Camille's shoulder, the assistant who had carried the makeup bag upstairs earlier, and she said that this was the woman she had seen. The young woman's face went white. Her lips moved soundlessly, and her eyes darted toward her employer. Cormac spun around, his voice dropping into a lower, harder register, as he ordered Bridget to be silent at once, saying she had no right to make such accusations in front of their guests, and that, at her age, she was only inviting trouble upon herself. Bridget looked at him. She had heard that voice since he was a young man. She had heard it order her to close the door, leave the room, hear nothing, see nothing, remember nothing, and she had obeyed every time. She said she had spent an entire lifetime keeping silent in this house, and she didn't know how many days she had left, but she knew that tonight she owed herself one truthful sentence. Then she added that if speaking it meant she had to leave, she would walk out through the front door, because she had never taken a single thing from this family. No one in the grand hall was speaking anymore. At some point, the music had stopped, and within that silence came the sound of wheelchair rims scraping against the stone floor, followed by the sound of a chair being pushed aside. Maeve was trying to stand. The servant beside her quickly reached out to help, but Maeve gently brushed the hand away. She gripped the arms of the wheelchair, forced her weight through both trembling arms, and managed to rise. She stood there in the middle of the hall, her back slightly bent, her hands unable to remain still for even a second. But when she spoke, not a single word in her voice trembled. She said that the brooch had been pinned to her dress by her mother-in-law on her wedding day, and that she had kept it through all those years so that one day she could pass it on to someone worthy of it. She said that tonight, after the ring ceremony, she had intended to give it away according to the tradition of the family. Then she looked slowly around the room, at Cormac, at the assistant with her head lowered, and finally at Camille, where her gaze remained for a very long time, and she said that only tonight had she learned who wasn't worthy even to touch it. Someone in the crowd drew in a sharp breath. Camille stepped half a pace forward and opened her mouth to say that Maeve was tired, that she was confused. But Maeve had already turned away and no longer looked at her. She looked toward Tessa instead, and said loudly enough for the entire hall to hear, "Take your coat, my dear. It's very cold tonight." It was only one simple sentence, but it made clearer than any defense whose word was trusted in this house. Tessa stood there with her arms at her sides, and for the first time all evening, her eyes filled with red, not because she had been accused, but because someone had chosen to defend her. Cormac tried to take control of the room again. He raised his voice and said this was a private family matter, that their honored guests should return to the hall and enjoy their wine, and that everything would be clarified later. But no one moved. 300 people filled the corridor and the grand hall, and every one of them was waiting to see what the man of the house would do. And then Grayson Calloway stepped through the crowd. He didn't look at Camille, and he didn't look at his uncle. He walked directly to the small table covered in white cloth at the center of the hall, where the engagement ring box had already been placed, and he reached down and picked it up. Tessa saw him pick up the ring box, and in her mind everything immediately became clear, so clear that it almost brought relief. She thought, this is over now. He will give her the ring, the music will begin again, the guests will applaud, and the matter of the brooch will be folded away as an unfortunate misunderstanding, so no one will have to trouble themselves over it any longer. She had already worked out in her head that she would step back behind the column, circle around to the kitchen entrance, collect her coat, and walk to the bus stop, and if she caught the late bus, she would be home before midnight. She had even lifted one foot to take half a step. Then she heard his shoes against the stone floor, and the sound wasn't moving toward Camille. It was moving toward her. Something very strange happened inside her chest at that moment. Not nervousness, but a sudden drop, like stepping toward the final stair only to discover that it wasn't there. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She wanted to move backward, but the cold wall of the corridor was already behind her. Grayson stopped in front of her, close enough for her to smell the wool of his coat, and then he did the thing she would dream about for many nights afterward. He lowered himself onto one knee on the stone floor, She heard his knee touch the ground. She even heard someone behind her drop a glass, but the sound of it breaking seemed impossibly far away, as though it had come from another room. He opened the ring box and said that all his life he had been taught that kindness was weakness, that whoever softened first was the one who lost. He said that during the past several months, he had stood outside his mother's door more times than she could imagine, and he had seen that she was stronger than every man in that room, because she was kind even when no one was paying her to be, even when no one was watching. He asked whether she would be willing to walk out of that corridor with him. Tessa stood there, and inside her mind there was no music at all, no lights, no 300 faces turned toward her. There was only one image, the image of a small room with a seashell-shaped nightlight glowing in the corner, and a little girl asleep inside it with a doll tucked beneath her chin, the child whose babysitter had sent a message earlier that evening to say she was already sleeping. She thought about how many phones her name would appear on by morning, and she thought about what the people standing there, the same people who only moments ago had been whispering behind her back, would say about her daughter. She thought about the world this man lived in, a world she didn't yet understand, but understood well enough to know that people in it always searched for what their opponent loved most, so they could place a hand upon exactly that place. And she understood that if she reached out her hand tonight, the most precious thing in her life would be placed on the table beside her. She heard her own voice, dry and quiet, but perfectly clear. She said that she had a daughter. She said that she had no right to gamble away her entire life because of one moment of emotion from him, and she would never allow anyone to turn her child into a weakness within his world. Then she spoke her final words, saying that she was sorry. Grayson remained on one knee for one more breath, looking up at her, and there was no anger in his eyes, only something very still. Tessa turned aside and placed the brooch Cormac had just returned to her on the white cloth covering the table. She walked to Maeve, bowed her head deeply, and Maeve reached out with a trembling hand to touch her arm without saying a word. Then Tessa turned her back and walked away. She passed through the crowd as it opened on both sides of her, moving past faces she would never be able to remember, while the worn soles of her shoes struck the stone floor in a steady rhythm through the silent hall. 1, 2, 1, 2, until she pushed open the back door, and the cold wind from the lake rushed against her face. She stood on the steps outside, pulled her coat closed, and thought that she had just shut a door, shut it completely, shut it forever. She had no idea that she had just opened another door, one that led directly to the truth about the night her husband never came home. Camille didn't cry, and she didn't make a scene, and that was what made her frightening. She crossed the hall with the measured stride of a woman who still knew she was being watched, stopped for exactly 1 second in front of Grayson, and told him that he had just made a mistake whose true size he couldn't yet imagine. Then she walked out through the front door, got into her car, and never looked back. The guests began leaving soon afterward, each of them suddenly remembering something urgent, each thanking the host in a voice lower than usual. In less than an hour, the mansion held nothing but its lights and long tables still covered with untouched food. In the study, Cormac poured himself a drink, then set it down without tasting it. He said that what had happened tonight wasn't about one woman, it was about scent. In the world where Grayson's father had spent his entire life, people didn't need proof before they attacked. They only needed to smell weakness. And tonight the Calloway family had allowed that scent to drift across the entire city. He said the Hastings family would withdraw, the Port partners would begin listening for rumors, and the men who had remained silent for years would start sitting down together and asking one another just how hard the Calloway boy still was. Grayson stood with his back to the fireplace and listened to every word. Then he said that if an empire had to grind a mother beneath its heel in order to purchase the respect of the world, then that empire deserved to fall. And if it collapsed because of what had happened tonight, then it had already been rotting long before this evening. Cormac looked at his nephew for a very long time. Then he set down his glass, said that Grayson's father wouldn't have thought that way, and walked out. But the cold part of Grayson hadn't died. It had only turned in another direction. That night, he called his private assistant, and the order he gave was as brief as every other order he had ever issued. He wanted to know everything about that woman, where she had been born, every place she had lived, every debt she owed, every person she still spoke to, everything. And he wanted it before dawn. He gave the order without once asking himself why. It was the instinct of a man who had spent his life knowing only one way to understand another person, by holding every part of them inside the palm of his hand. The file was waiting on the desk in his study before the sky had begun to brighten. It was thicker than he had expected, and he had turned only a few of the opening pages when the door opened. Maeve stood there with one hand gripping the frame and the other resting on a cane, her hair hastily tied back, her body still wrapped in a nightrobe. She didn't ask what he was doing. She only looked at the papers on the desk, saw the name printed in the corner of the page, and said that his father had once kept a file just like that on her. She said that back then she had been nothing more than the daughter of a piano repairman, and his father had known everything about her before their first date. What kind of tea she preferred, how much her family owed and to whom. Even that her brother had once been arrested for fighting outside a bar. She asked whether he knew how long it had taken her to stop feeling like prey inside her own home. Then she said that she didn't blame his father, because he had only known how to love in the single way he had been taught. But she had already spent her entire life living inside that kind of love, and she didn't want to see it happen again beneath this roof. Grayson remained still for a long time. Then he picked up the file without turning another page and threw it into the fireplace. He stood there watching the flames catch along the edges, curling the paper as they slowly consumed the lines he would never read. Maeve asked him why it was her. Grayson looked into the fire and said that she was the second person in his life who had dared to tell him no, and both times it had been the same woman. Maeve nodded, turned toward the door with the help of her cane, and before closing it, she told him that if he wanted to understand someone, he should go and stand beside them, not read about them. The flames licked through the final pages and slowly faded into ash. Grayson had no idea that every file gathered by the family's people passed through his uncle's hands before reaching his desk, and at that very moment, only a few rooms away, a second copy lay undisturbed inside a locked drawer. The call from the home care agency came in the middle of the following morning, just after Tessa had finished clearing away the breakfast dishes. The coordinator spoke very quickly, her voice polite and tired, saying that a complaint had been made by the client regarding an incident the night before, that under company policy, in situations like this, they were required to suspend her employment contract until the matter had been clarified, and that Tessa should understand the company wasn't reaching any conclusion, it was simply policy. Tessa said she understood, thanked her, and ended the call. She stood beside the sink for a while, her hands still wet, looking through the small window at several wilted plants she kept forgetting to water. She didn't call back. She didn't cry either. She dried her hands, sat down in a chair, and remained there until nightfall. That night, after her daughter had fallen deeply asleep in the little room with the seashell-shaped lamp, Tessa lowered herself onto the floor beside the child's bed, rested her back against the frame, and allowed everything she had kept locked inside her chest for so long to pour out. She remembered that she had begun this life as nothing more than a name written across the cover of a case file, a child moved from one home to another, with a cloth bag always packed beside the door, because she never knew when she would have to leave again. She remembered one family sending her back because they had a baby of their own, another returning her because they were moving to another state, and another offering no reason at all. She remembered learning very early never to let her belongings take up too much space in any room. Then she remembered Caleb. He was a firefighter, and she met him on the night the fire alarm went off in the old building where she rented a room because someone had forgotten a pan on the stove. He was the man who climbed the stairs and checked every floor, and hers was the last door he knocked on. She remembered telling him later, after they had shared many meals together, that she was afraid she was the kind of person everyone eventually returned. And she remembered how he set down his fork, looked at her for a long time, and said that she wasn't something people had returned. She was simply someone no one had ever known how to hold properly. They were married at City Hall on a Tuesday morning with no guests, wearing 2 silver rings bought from a little shop on the way home, and their wedding reception was 2 bowls of noodles at the restaurant on the corner, with a candle standing inside a glass of water. She remembered the mornings when he came home after his shift, with the smell of smoke clinging to him, sat on the kitchen floor to remove his boots, and told her about the people he had managed to bring outside, while remaining silent about the ones he hadn't. Then she remembered that afternoon. She was in the final months of pregnancy, her belly already so heavy that she had to brace one hand against the table whenever she stood. She had cooked early because he had sent a message saying he would be home for dinner. The rice slowly grew cold on the stove, and she reheated it once, then twice. Darkness settled completely outside. Then the doorbell rang. She remembered hurrying to open the door with joy, and she remembered the moment it swung open, and the person standing outside wasn't him, but 3 people in uniform, all 3 of them removing their hats when they saw her. She couldn't remember what they said. She only remembered that she was still holding a kitchen towel in one hand, and that at that exact moment, the baby inside her suddenly kicked with terrible force. The days that followed passed as though she were watching them through clouded glass. Her husband's family handled all the arrangements, while she sat in the corner and signed wherever she was told to sign. Then, after the funeral, her mother-in-law looked at her and asked the question Tessa would carry for many years. Why hadn't she kept him there? Why hadn't she told him to stay home that day? Her husband's brother said the house had been placed in their names by the parents, and now that Caleb was gone, it had to be returned. She left that house with one suitcase and one cloth bag, exactly as she had when she was a child. She gave birth alone in the hospital, one hand gripping the side of the bed, with no one waiting for her in the corridor. When the doctor said there was something wrong with the baby's heart and handed her a consent form, she signed that alone too, and she remembered that her hand trembled so badly, her signature twisted out of shape. During the nights that followed, she slept in a plastic chair outside the cardiac ward, and it was in that very chair that she began opening books and studying for her nursing certification, because she had grown too tired of sitting there, listening to doctors speak without understanding what they were saying about her child. Now, sitting on the floor in the darkness, Tessa turned and looked at her sleeping daughter, one small hand tucked beneath her cheek, the doll held under her chin. On the table beside the door lay a stack of letters from the past several days that she hadn't opened, and somewhere inside that stack was an envelope bearing the hospital seal, one she had picked up 3 times and then put down again. The next morning, she opened the envelope while standing beside the table, read it once from beginning to end, then read it again because the first time the words had simply drifted past her eyes without settling anywhere. The letter said that after the most recent follow-up examination, the medical board had concluded that her daughter needed a second procedure sooner than originally expected. It said the insurance coverage would reach only a very small corner of the total cost, that the remainder would be the family's responsibility, and beneath those words was a number that forced Tessa to sit down after she read it. It was a number she couldn't reach, even if she worked both shifts every day, never took a day off, never became ill, never missed a bus, and never had to pay rent, not until many years had passed. The final line said that the tentative surgical date could be held only from now through the end of winter, after which the case would be placed back in the queue. She folded the letter, put it into a drawer, then washed her face and woke her daughter for school. And throughout that entire day, she smiled at the child exactly as she always did. Cormac Calloway arrived the following evening. He didn't call ahead and brought no one with him. There was only a black car parked at the curb and an older man in a wool coat knocking on the door of the 3rd-floor apartment. Tessa opened the door and recognized him at once. She glanced toward the inner room, where her daughter had been asleep since early evening with the door left slightly open, then stepped into the hallway to speak with him there, but he said he was asking for only 5 minutes and didn't want the neighbors to hear. She allowed him inside, closed her daughter's door with great care, and invited him to sit in the only empty chair in the kitchen. He didn't drink the water she poured. He placed a thin file on the table and pushed it toward her. He said he hadn't brought money, because money was too easy to refuse. He told her to open it and look. Inside was a letter of acceptance from a children's hospital on the East Coast, a name every mother who had ever sat outside a cardiac ward had heard spoken with longing. It included the surgeon's name, an appointment date, a guarantee covering the entire cost of the operation and all post-operative care, and even housing assistance for the family during treatment. Nothing was missing. Cormac said he had arranged everything, and all that remained was one signature. Then he stated the condition, his voice as calm as though he were discussing the weather. She would leave Chicago, never return, and have no contact with anyone carrying the Calloway name. He added that he wasn't insulting her. He was simply offering her exactly what a mother in her circumstances needed most. And he would never tell anyone about this meeting. After he left, Tessa remained alone at the kitchen table with the file open before her. She read every line. She took a ballpoint pen from the holder, the same pen she used to sign the care log after every shift, and raised it in her hand. She placed the tip against the paper. She sat that way for a very long time, long enough for the pen to leave a small dot of ink on the white page. In the room beyond, her daughter turned once in her sleep and then became still again. Tessa thought about the corridor outside the cardiac ward, about all those nights spent sleeping in a plastic chair, and about how one signature could bring every one of those nights to an end. Then she thought about something else. She imagined 15 years from now, when the girl was grown, and one day asked her mother why she had been raised in another city. By morning, Tessa had made her decision. The following day, she took a bus to the address printed on the business card, waited in the lobby for nearly an hour, and when Cormac came downstairs, she returned the file to him untouched, without a signature anywhere, only a small dot of ink in the corner of the page. She said she had almost signed it, and she wanted him to know that. She said that for her daughter, she would kneel before him right there in the lobby, and she wouldn't feel one moment of shame. But she said that if she taught her child that someone could buy her mother simply by offering the right price at the moment she was most desperate, then the heart she saved would belong only to a child who grew up believing that everything in this world could be sold. She said she would find another way. She didn't know what that way would be, but she would find it. Then she thanked him for not speaking loudly outside her door. Cormac remained standing in the center of the lobby, watching her walk toward the revolving doors, the file still in his hands, and for the first time in his life, that man was afraid of someone who had nothing left to lose. Bridget Doyle was the one who told Grayson. She hadn't been prying. She had simply happened to be in the kitchen when Cormac's driver came in asking for a cup of coffee, and complained that the night before he had been sent all the way to Pilsen and made to wait at the curb for nearly half an hour. Bridget asked one more question, then went upstairs, knocked on the study door, and repeated exactly what she had heard, without adding a single word. Grayson didn't pound the desk or raise his voice at anyone. He only thanked her, then sat there in silence for a very long time. 3 days later, the family council was summoned, something this house did only when there had been a death or when a great deal of money was at stake. Elderly men filled every chair around the long table in the old dining room, and some of them had grown so accustomed to seeing Grayson's father seated at the head of it that their eyes still drifted toward that empty place out of habit. Grayson remained standing. He said that from that day forward, his uncle would no longer have the authority to negotiate or represent the family in any discussion, and every file produced by the Information Gathering Division would be delivered directly to him without passing through anyone else. Cormac didn't argue. He only asked why, and Grayson said that someone had used a child's surgery as a bargaining condition in the name of their family, and as long as he remained in his position, it would never happen a second time. The entire table fell silent. Then he opened the document he had kept private since his father's funeral, and he read aloud what the old man had instructed during the final weeks of his life, that the family was to withdraw completely from every business conducted in the shadows, transfer everything into work that could be signed in daylight, and finish the transition before the lives of their grandchildren truly began. Some objected, saying that abandoning those operations meant losing their source of ready cash. Others said they would be cutting off their own hand in front of the other families. Grayson listened to all of them, then said that his father had built this house so no one bearing the Calloway name would ever have to bow before anyone, not so that one day they would sit around that table and force a mother to choose between her child's life and her own dignity. He said that if their name could stand only through acts like that, then it wasn't worth preserving. No one said anything more. That afternoon, he went to the third-floor apartment in Pilsen. He brought nothing with him, no flowers, no envelope, and no one accompanying him. And he remained outside the door to speak, rather than entering. He told Tessa that the home care agency had contacted her again and reinstated her shifts, and he made it clear that it hadn't happened because he had called them. He explained that Bridget had written a statement herself, then carried it downstairs to the staff area, where everyone employed at the mansion had signed it, from the chef to the 2 gardeners, including the young woman who had been working there for only a few months. He said that statement was what had been sent to the company. Then he told her that he hadn't purchased her honor back for her. She had preserved it herself. Tessa stood in the doorway, still holding a dish towel, and she didn't know how to answer, so she invited him inside for a glass of water. They sat at the kitchen table, and at first she said very little, but when he asked what those days outside the hospital ward had been like, she began to tell him. And once she started, she couldn't stop. She told him about the mothers who slept in plastic chairs outside the cardiac ward, each using a folded coat as a pillow, some of them remaining there for months. She told him about people who had been forced to sell their cars to pay 1 round of hospital bills, and afterward had no way to reach the hospital. She told him about a mother she had known who sat in the corridor all night, holding a surgical appointment letter without daring to open it because she knew she couldn't afford what was inside, and she said the most painful part wasn't having no money. It was sitting beside your child and knowing that the only thing standing between that child and life was a number. Grayson listened to everything without interrupting once. When she finally stopped, he asked her that if there were a fund, how should it operate? so that people were never made to feel like beggars. She thought for a moment, then said it needed clear eligibility standards, a professional medical board to review every case, a publicly available list, and an absolute rule that no one could receive special treatment because of personal connections. The fund bearing his mother's name was born that afternoon at a kitchen table, whose glass surface was cracked at one corner. Tessa submitted her daughter's application exactly as everyone else did, placed in the same stack, and reviewed by the same board, and she made it clear from the beginning that if her child received any special priority, she would withdraw the application. It was approved 3 weeks later, through the proper process, without special treatment. The black car was still there the next morning, in the exact same spot. Engine idling, windows dark. Tessa told herself it belonged to someone in the building. A visitor, a driver waiting on a fare, and she went to work and came home, and thought about it less than she'd expected to. On the third morning it was there again, and this time, when she came down the stairs, she found an envelope wedged into the gap of the lobby door with her name printed on it. Inside there were no words at all. There were photographs. Her at the bus stop on 18th Street, with her bag on her shoulder. Her coming out of the service entrance of the estate. Her walking the 2 blocks from the pharmacy with a paper sack, each one taken from a distance, each one on a different day, and along the bottom of every print, a time. Nothing else. No threat, no demand, no signature. Tessa stood in that cold lobby holding them, and understood that whoever sent them hadn't wanted to frighten her at all. They'd wanted them shown to someone else. She called Grayson. He came within the hour, took the envelope, and spread the photographs across her kitchen table in silence. He looked at them for a long time. Then he gathered them up, put them back in the envelope, and told her she shouldn't take the same bus twice this week, and that she should let Bridget know when she left the estate at night. He didn't tell her not to worry. He'd never once lied to her, and he didn't start there. Back at the house, in the room where his father used to sit, 3 of his men were waiting. Grayson said nothing about the envelope. He simply reached down, unfastened the watch from his wrist, and set it on the table in front of him. The oldest of the 3 straightened where he stood. The other 2 glanced at each other. Nobody asked a single question, because in that house, everyone knew what it meant when he took the watch off. It meant the part of him that measured things in quarters and contracts had been put away for a while. The meeting was arranged for the following night, in a warehouse near the South Docks, on ground that belonged to neither family. Wexler came with 6 men. Grayson came with 2, and left them at the door. When he stepped into the pool of light where the table stood, all 6 of Wexler's men shifted backward. Not because anyone told them to, not because he'd said a word, but the way men move away from the edge of a platform when a train comes through. Wexler noticed it, and Wexler's jaw tightened, because a man notices when his own people do that. There were 2 cups of coffee on the table. Neither man touched his. Wexler spoke first, saying he'd heard the Callaways were going legitimate these days, going quiet, going soft, and that he'd only sent a courtesy, a little reminder that people were paying attention. Grayson sat down, unbuttoned his coat, and set a folder on the table between them. He said his father had spent the better part of his life putting that folder together, and that the old man had told him it was only ever to be opened to protect the family. He said Wexler was welcome to read the first page. Wexler read it. His hand went flat on the table. Grayson said he was walking out of the dark, and that he wanted that understood correctly, because a lot of men were misunderstanding it lately. He said he was walking out because he'd chosen to, not because he'd forgotten the way back in. Then he leaned forward slightly, and his voice didn't rise at all. And he said that if a car belonging to anyone at that table appeared anywhere near her again, then the thing parked outside Wexler's own door wouldn't be his car. Nobody moved. Wexler sat with his hand on the folder, and after a while he said that they understood each other, and that the matter was closed. Grayson stood, buttoned his coat, and walked out past the 6 men, and every one of them found somewhere else to look. He was in the car before the tightness left his chest. What he didn't know, what nobody in that warehouse said out loud, was that the Wexlers hadn't come to that meeting empty. 2 days earlier, a woman from the Hastings family had sat across from them in a private dining room and slid a thin stack of old paperwork across the linen, saying it was a gift, a token of goodwill between houses that ought to be friends. The Wexlers had backed off the woman. They'd never said a word about what they were still holding. The article appeared on an early spring morning on a news site devoted to digging through the private lives of Chicago's wealthy, and it was written in that particular voice, half sympathetic and half venomous, that such sites had mastered so well. The headline spoke of a charitable foundation named after a frail elderly woman and of the woman who stood behind it. Beneath it were several photographs, one showing Tessa leaving the gates of the mansion, another showing her standing beside Grayson somewhere, the angle making them appear far more intimate than they truly were, and a third that had clearly been altered, because she recognized the coat in the picture as one she had thrown away the previous winter. The article claimed that a female nurse had skillfully worked her way into the household of a wealthy family, that questions were being raised about why her daughter had been among the first children approved for assistance from the foundation, and that some mothers knew how to use their child's illness as a ticket. Tessa read the entire article. Then she read it again. She had survived too much to collapse beneath a few lines of print. She had once been accused of theft in the middle of a crowded hall, and she had managed to rise after that. But when she reached the passage about her daughter, something inside her chest slammed shut. That afternoon, when she went to collect Poppy from school, two mothers standing near the gate stopped talking as she passed, then resumed the moment she was behind them. Poppy noticed nothing. She was too busy telling her mother which animal the teacher had asked them to draw that day. That evening, after her daughter had fallen asleep, Tessa brought paper and a pen to the kitchen table and began to calculate. She worked out what rent might cost in a smaller city, how far the nearest children's hospital would be, and whether her nursing certification would remain valid in another state. She wrote a long column of numbers, then sat staring at it for a very long time, and she understood that this time she wasn't planning to run away from anyone. She was only trying to find a place where her daughter could grow up without hearing people whisper behind her mother's back. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the Hastings family was doing something entirely different. They weren't publishing articles or releasing photographs. They were digging. After the night of the party, they had ordered a review of everything the Calloway family had placed under its name over the years: subsidiary companies, contract bids, and expenses recorded under deliberately vague descriptions. And they found a man, an elderly accountant who had retired long ago and now lived in a small house in the suburbs with a garden kept in meticulous order, a man Cormac had once forced out of the company after he asked too many questions about a particular payment. He had kept a set of records, not to blackmail anyone, but, as he told the Hastings representatives, to protect himself, because he knew exactly whom he had been working for. They didn't have to pay him very much. People didn't need to offer much to a man who had carried resentment inside him for so many years. Then the Hastings family placed those records on the Wexler dining table like an introductory gift. And after the night at the warehouse by the harbor, the Wexlers calculated very quickly that possessing them would be more useful than using them, at least until they knew for certain whom they should sell them to. But in a city like Chicago, no stack of papers remained still for long. It reached Grayson on a weekend evening through a man who had once owed a debt to his father, delivered personally inside a stiff cardboard envelope with no writing on it. Grayson opened it at his desk, skimmed the first page, and at first saw only something familiar: an old arrangement. A payment entered beneath another category, his uncle's signature at the bottom. Then his eyes reached the name of the project. He read it once. He read it again. He turned to the next page in search of the date, and there it was, typed neatly among the dry, lifeless lines of an official record. He sat perfectly still. The hand holding the page remained in the same position for a very long time, neither trembling nor lowering. Outside the window, a car horn sounded from the street below. He heard it, but it seemed impossibly far away. Inside his mind, everything stopped. Every calculation, every plan, everything he had built during the past several months, all of it becoming silent and motionless like a machine whose power had suddenly been cut. He looked at that name for a little longer, then placed the page carefully on the desk, as though setting down something that might shatter. He looked at the clock on the wall. By morning, the file would begin making its first rounds, and once it started moving, no one would be able to stop it. He had exactly one night to destroy with his own hands the most precious thing his life had ever given him, using the truth. He called her just as dawn began to break, and he didn't tell her why. He only asked whether she could go somewhere with him that morning, and there was something in his voice that made her put on her coat without asking another question. He drove himself, and no one accompanied them. The car headed northwest, beyond the streets she knew, then turned into an area that had been completed long ago, with low buildings of gray glass and a broad parking lot. When he stopped, Tessa looked through the window and recognized the place. She had come here once, many years earlier, when it was still an empty stretch of land, enclosed by a corrugated metal fence, and she had stood outside that fence without ever stepping through it. At the edge of the parking lot, beneath a young maple tree, stood a low block of granite bearing a tarnished bronze plaque, and several names had been carved into it in a single vertical line. Her husband's name was in the middle. Tessa stepped out of the car, walked toward it, and stood there looking at the name without speaking. Grayson remained several steps behind her. Then he began to speak. He said that at the time, the project had belonged to a construction company, and that company had been a subsidiary within his family's network, registered under someone else's name, though the money behind it had belonged to his family. He said his uncle had been responsible for that division that year, and in order to keep the contract profitable when material costs rose, many expenses had been reduced, including the money allocated for site safety, both equipment and supervision. He said the construction crew had submitted formal concerns at least twice, and both times they had received no response. Then he told her the final part. He said that after what happened there, his uncle had used money and influence to have the case closed, the report rewritten in another direction, the parties quietly handled, and no one held accountable for anything. He said he had learned the truth only the night before, and he added that he knew she wouldn't believe that, but he still had to say it. Tessa kept her eyes on the bronze plaque. The morning wind swept across the parking lot and slipped inside the collar of her coat, but she didn't pull it closed. Then Grayson did something no one in that city had ever seen him do. Not even the people who had feared him all their lives. He knelt on the cold pavement before the memorial, not before her, but before the names carved into the stone, and he said he wasn't asking her forgiveness, because this wasn't his sin to ask forgiveness for. It belonged to 3 generations of men in his family, and he understood very clearly that the name he carried was the same name that had taken her daughter's father away, before the child had even been born. He said he would do everything, and he would do it whether she stayed or not. Tessa turned and looked at him. She looked at the man kneeling on the pavement, the man who had spent an entire afternoon in the hospital corridor with a doll lying at his feet, the man who read stories in such an even voice that her daughter had to correct him word by word, the man whom she had begun, very slowly and very cautiously, to allow through the door she had kept closed for so many years. She didn't scream. She didn't rush toward him. She didn't ask a single question, didn't demand that he explain anything further, and she didn't say that she understood, because she didn't understand, and because there was no room inside her chest at that moment for even one word. She only looked at him for a very long time. Then she reached out and touched the granite once, pressing her palm against it for several seconds, before drawing her hand away, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and walking off. She didn't walk toward the car. She crossed the parking lot, reached the roadside, and continued on foot along the road toward a bus stop about 1 mile away, her figure small and straight, never looking back once. Grayson remained kneeling there until she disappeared from sight. That evening, after her daughter had fallen asleep, Tessa sat on the edge of her own bed in the darkness. She remained still for a very long time. Then she opened the drawer of her nightstand, took out the old phone she had continued charging once a month through all those years, and placed it in the palm of her hand. The phone lay in her palm, smaller and heavier than she remembered. She plugged it into the charger, and the old logo appeared on the screen just as it had once every month for all those years, each time for only a few minutes, only long enough for her to know it was still alive before she unplugged it and returned it to the drawer. She had never opened anything inside it. She unlocked it with the number she still remembered, and in the corner of the screen was a voicemail icon. One unheard message sent on the morning of that day. She had known it was there since the first week. She had picked up the phone many times over the years, and every time she had put it back down, because she was afraid that if she listened to it, she would never be able to stand again, and back then she had no choice but to stand. There was a baby who needed her to rise every morning. Tonight, she sat in the darkness with only the streetlight slipping through the narrow gap in the curtains, and she pressed play. First came the sound of wind, then a low roaring noise, then people calling to one another somewhere in the distance, then his voice. He was breathing hard, his voice roughened by smoke, speaking quickly like a man who had only a few seconds. He said the structure was bad, sweetheart, worse than he had thought. He said there were still 2 people inside, that he was going in one more time, and then he would come home. Someone called his name, and he said something to that person before turning back to the phone. He laughed. She heard that laugh clearly, short and tired, exactly the way he used to laugh while taking off his boots on the kitchen floor after a shift. He said that if the baby was a girl, he hoped she would have Tessa's eyes. Then he fell silent for one breath, and he spoke his final words more slowly than everything that had come before. He told her that if there ever came a day when he didn't make it home in time, she mustn't close the door of her heart because of him. He told her she had been born to be loved, not merely to survive. The message ended. The phone gave a small beep and went silent. Tessa sat perfectly still. She didn't cry at first. For a very long time, she simply remained there with the phone in her hand and nothing at all inside her mind. Then it came, all of it at once, and she bent forward, pressed the phone against her chest, and cried in the way people can cry only when no one else in the house is awake. She cried for the afternoon when the pot of rice had been reheated twice. She cried for all the years she had carried the question her mother-in-law had thrown at her after the funeral. The question of why she hadn't kept him there, why she hadn't made him stay home, the question she had quietly believed to be true for all that time. Now she knew. He had known the structure was bad. He had known, and he had still gone back inside because two people remained there. No one could have held him back. Not even her. Not even if she had been standing beside him with both hands wrapped around his. He had gone in that final time because that was the kind of man he was, and it was because he was that kind of man that she had loved him. Then she understood the second thing. It came later, and it made her sit upright in the darkness. He had asked one thing of her, only one thing, and for all these years, she had done exactly the opposite. The next morning, Poppy woke early and ran to her mother's bed carrying a drawing still marked with the deep grooves of crayon. She said, "Look, Mommy, I drew our family." At the top of the picture was a large white cloud, and on the cloud stood a man wearing a red helmet, one hand raised in a wave. Below, on green ground, stood a brown-haired mother, an elderly woman sitting in a chair, and at the far right, separated by a little space, there was another tall man dressed in black. Tessa looked at that final figure for a long time. She asked her daughter who it was. Poppy answered that it was the sad-eyed man, of course. Then the child looked at her mother, saw her silence, and added in the patient, explanatory voice children use when grown people are slow to understand. "The sky is very big, Mommy. Daddy can stand up there, and there's still plenty of room for him to stand down here." Tessa pulled her daughter into her arms and held her for a very long time, her chin resting against the child's hair, her eyes turned toward the window where the early spring sunlight was slowly climbing across the sill. On the other side of the city, in an office high above the streets, Grayson sat before a set of documents the lawyers had finished reviewing during the night, and on the final page was a list. He had read it 3 times. He knew what would happen when that list was made public. And he knew that it contained one name that would leave her frozen with grief all over again. He didn't wait for anyone to force his hand. On Monday morning, the family's attorneys submitted the entire file to the city investigators. Accompanied by a statement, Grayson delivered himself before the cameras, brief and direct, admitting that the construction company behind the project had belonged to his family's network, that spending on safety had been cut, and that after the accident, the case had been closed through money and influence. He announced that compensation proceedings would be reopened for every family involved, at amounts determined by an independent panel rather than by his own family, and he said the Calloways would cooperate with every investigative request without asking for leniency of any kind. Across the city, in a room where several men sat around a table, the Wexlers opened the newspaper, read it, then threw it down. The records they had carefully hidden away until the day they could sell them for the highest price had suddenly become worthless, because the man they intended to blackmail had carried the truth into broad daylight himself. The price the Calloway family had to pay was anything but small. The penalty was so enormous that they were forced to sell part of their assets. The construction division was permanently closed, its licenses were revoked, and the family name remained on the front page for days. Grayson signed every document with his own hand and passed responsibility to no one. That night, he returned home, removed his coat, lay down, and slept until morning without waking once. The first unbroken sleep he had known in many years. Cormac didn't wait to be stripped of what little authority remained to him. He resigned from every position within the family, used his personal fortune to establish a compensation fund for the workers' families, signed control of it over to the attorneys, then moved into a small house in the suburbs and refused to see anyone. The following week, the list of everyone who had accepted settlement payments years earlier was released with the case records. Tessa read it one evening at the kitchen table, while her daughter sat drawing in the next room, crayons scattered across the floor. She read from top to bottom, through company names and the names of people she didn't know. Then she stopped. Near the end of the list were the names of her husband's parents. She read them again. She turned to the appendix. And there, in the dry language of a typed report, everything became painfully clear. During the final weeks of her pregnancy, when she had been hospitalized for observation, her husband's family had handled every document connected to Caleb, and during that time, they had met with representatives of the company, accepted a payment, and signed a silence agreement. What left her frozen at that kitchen table wasn't the money. She had never needed that money. What made coldness spread through her body was something else. Not once, not a single time in all those years, had anyone told her that compensation had existed, that there had been an investigation, or that workers had submitted warnings twice and no one had answered them. She hadn't lost her rights. She had simply been denied the right to know. And then she understood the final part, the part she had believed for years belonged to her. They had blamed her, asked her that question after the funeral, taken back the house, and cut off all contact. Not because they hated her, but because they needed her gone before she could begin asking questions. For all those years, she had carried a burden of guilt that someone else had deliberately placed upon her back. The elderly woman came to Tessa's home on a weekend afternoon, about 2 weeks later. She came alone, leaning on a cane, much thinner than the last time Tessa had seen her, wearing an old coat, her hair completely white. She stood in the hallway and said that her eldest son no longer answered when she called, that the money had been gone for years, and that she now lived alone. Then, before Tessa could react, the old woman lowered herself onto her knees in the middle of the corridor with the help of her cane. Tessa hurried forward to help her, but the woman held tightly to her wrist and offered her something wrapped inside a handkerchief. Within it was Caleb's firefighter badge, tarnished around the edges, the only thing she had managed to keep and hide when everything else was taken away. She said she knew she had no right to ask for anything. She said she had asked Tessa that question after the funeral because she hadn't dared to look where she truly should have looked, and because blaming Tessa had been far easier than admitting that she had signed that paper. Tessa helped her to her feet, guided her to sit on the stair, and sat beside her. She said she couldn't forget, and she wouldn't lie by pretending that she could, but she said she wouldn't allow her daughter to grow up in a family that learned hatred before it learned love, and that the woman was still the child's grandmother, something no one could buy and no one could sell. The old woman began to sob aloud, both trembling hands wrapped around Tessa's. Then she looked up, her lips trembling, and admitted there was one more secret she lacked the courage to reveal, promising that one day, someone else would tell her. The Hastings family couldn't tolerate the scent of an open investigation. When their name began appearing at the edges of news reports, and when their lawyers calculated that handing a bundle of old documents to another family could be described in court by several very unpleasant names, they did what families like theirs had always done. They cut away the part that was bleeding. Camille was quietly arranged a position at the European branch, and a flight at the end of the week. She came to the mansion one final time to collect a few belongings she had left behind, and on her way out, she met Tessa coming in. The two women stopped several steps apart. Camille looked her over from head to toe, then said that in the end, Tessa had gotten everything. Tessa shook her head and said no. She had only managed to keep the one thing she had carried with her from the beginning, while Camille had lost something she had never truly possessed, someone who sincerely stood beside her. Camille couldn't answer. She remained there for one more moment, then walked toward the door, her heels striking the stone floor, and this time there was no one left behind to watch her go. Spring passed, and by the beginning of summer, the small garden bed behind the mansion was filled with a row of sunflowers taller than a grown person. Poppy still claimed all the credit, and she told everyone who stepped into the garden that the place belonged to her because she had planted it, while Maeve had only held the bag of seeds. That afternoon, Grayson arrived earlier than usual, and he hadn't brought a book with him. He sat on the step beside the child, near several pots of soil and a small plastic shovel, and told her that he had something important to ask, and that it was something he had to ask her first, because asking her mother first would be wrong. Poppy set down the shovel and sat up straight, looking very much like someone about to be consulted on a matter of great importance. He asked whether she would agree to let him live in the same house with her and her mother, take her to school, sit outside in the corridor every time she went for a medical appointment, and take care of both of them from that day forward. The child considered the question with complete seriousness, her eyes lowered to the crumbs of soil scattered across her knees. Then she nodded. But she said he had to promise one thing. He asked what it was. She told him he had to promise not to make her mother cry, because her mother always cried in the bathroom, and even though she turned the water on very loudly, Poppy could still hear her, though her mother thought she didn't know. Tessa was standing on the step behind them. She set down the tray, walked forward, then crouched and pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her tightly while tears ran into the child's hair and laughter broke through her voice. She said she was sorry, that it was true she had cried, but she wanted Poppy to listen carefully. Those times had happened only because she had been too tired, and she was doing much better now, and she promised that from then on, whenever something was wrong, she would tell her instead of hiding in the bathroom. Poppy nodded, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had finally resolved a matter left unfinished for far too long. Grayson lowered himself onto one knee in the grass until his eyes were level with hers, and he told her that he promised. He said he couldn't promise that her mother would never feel sad again, because that wasn't something he could promise anyone. But he could promise that from now on, every time her mother was sad, someone would sit beside her, and she would never have to turn the water on loudly again. Then he raised his eyes to Tessa. He didn't stand. He said that the first time he had asked her, he had done it in the middle of a hall filled with people, at the worst possible moment, when he knew nothing about her, and hadn't deserved to hear any answer from her. He said that now she knew everything about him, including the name he carried and what that name had done, and he had nothing left to hide. He said he wasn't asking her to forget, and he wasn't asking her to forgive on anyone else's behalf. He was only asking whether she would allow him to walk beside her, slowly if necessary, for as long as necessary. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a simple ring, not the ring from that night. Tessa looked at him, then down at her daughter, who was holding tightly to her sleeve and gazing up in anticipation, then toward the row of sunflowers. Every one of them turned toward the late afternoon sun. She remembered the words someone had spoken to her a very long time ago, that she had been born to be loved. And she nodded. The wedding was set for the middle of summer in an old stone church south of the city, where the stained glass windows had faded beneath the sunlight of many years. Half an hour before the ceremony, while Tessa sat in the small room behind the sanctuary, and Bridget had just finished fastening the final flower into her hair, there came a knock at the door, and Maeve entered, leaning on her cane, her other hand holding an envelope yellowed around the edges. She asked Bridget to give them a few minutes alone. She sat in the chair across from the bride, placed the envelope on her knees, and said there was something she had carried inside her heart for a very long time, something she had promised herself she would reveal only on this exact day. She began from far away. She told Tessa that many years earlier, when she was still young, she had lost a daughter who never had the chance to be born, and she spoke of it in the calm voice of a woman who had lived with that pain for so long that it had become part of the rhythm of her breathing. She said her husband never mentioned it again. No one else in the family ever spoke of it either. And in that house, she had learned to remain silent about everything. Then she moved forward through the years, to the winter when she was diagnosed, to those first months when her hands began refusing to obey her, when she lay in the hospital and spent many nights staring at the ceiling, honestly wishing that she wouldn't wake the following morning. She said the person who pulled her out of those nights wasn't a doctor, but the elderly woman in the bed beside hers, a woman older than Maeve, cheerful by nature, always telling stories, always insisting that Maeve sit up and look through the window to see how beautiful the day was. She said that woman had spent part of her life in darkness, her eyesight almost completely gone, until she received corneal transplants from a donor and was able to see again. Maeve said the woman often told her that waking each morning and merely being able to see the ceiling was enough to make someone want to live one more day. Maeve said it was that sentence, repeated again and again throughout all those months in the hospital room, that had kept her in this world. Then she opened the yellowed envelope and removed a sheet of paper folded into quarters. She said that before the woman died, she had given this paper to Maeve. It was a copy of the thank you letter she had written to the donor's family through the Transplant Coordination Organization, the kind of letter that was delivered only when both sides agreed. Maeve said the donor's family had signed consent, allowing the identity to be disclosed, and beneath the letter, the organization had recorded the donor's name. She handed the paper to Tessa. Tessa opened it, read the name, then read it again, and her hands began to tremble. Maeve continued very slowly, saying that the people who had signed the consent that day were Tessa's husband's parents, because at the time they had handled all the arrangements, and they hadn't told her, just as they hadn't told her so many other things. She said this was the very thing the elderly woman hadn't found the courage to reveal to Tessa in the hallway. Then Maeve told her the final part. She said that many winters later, when the home care agency sent the file of a new nurse, she had skimmed through it as she always did, until her eyes stopped on the line describing the woman's marital status: widowed, husband, a firefighter, followed by the name written immediately after it. She said she had sat motionless in her room that afternoon until darkness completely filled it, without turning on a light or calling anyone. She took both of the bride's hands and said that Tessa's husband had never met her even once in his life. He hadn't known who she was at all, but the light he left behind had traveled a very long way, passing through a woman he had never known and illuminating that woman's life again, and then that same woman had kept Maeve in this world for all those additional years, long enough for her to be sitting there today, returning this to his wife. Tessa couldn't speak. She lowered her head, and Maeve raised her trembling hands, taking a long time to fasten the emerald brooch to the front of Tessa's wedding dress, the same brooch that someone had once slipped into her coat pocket on an autumn night in a corridor filled with people. Maeve smoothed the fabric, admired it for a moment, then said that on the night they pulled it out to humiliate her, Maeve had known at once whom it truly belonged to. She said that today, everyone in the church would know. Outside the church doors, 2 rows of people stood along the entrance path, all dressed in deep navy ceremonial uniforms, with gleaming buttons, their caps tucked beneath their arms, their backs straight. They were the people who had once worked the same shifts as Caleb Merrick, the ones who had stood on her doorstep that afternoon and removed their caps, and now they had come here without being called and without receiving an invitation, simply because they had heard the news and gathered together to escort the wife of their fallen brother through the doors of the church. When Tessa reached the beginning of the path, both rows came to attention. There was no applause and no cheering, only the sound of the wind and shoes touching stone, and she walked between them with both trembling hands wrapped around her bouquet. Inside the church, there wasn't a single face from Chicago high society. Every pew was filled with the entire staff of the mansion, led by Bridget, the doctors and nurses from the cardiac ward, and the families whose children had received help from the foundation bearing Maeve's name, many of them holding their children in their arms, while some of the little ones sat on their father's shoulders so they could see more clearly. Poppy walked ahead, scattering brilliant yellow sunflower petals along the aisle, and pinned to the front of her small dress was the firefighter badge, tarnished around the edges. In the middle of the ceremony, Maeve asked to say a few words. Someone helped her to her feet, and she stood there with one hand gripping the back of the chair as she told the story before everyone, the story of the hospital room many years earlier, of the woman in the bed beside her, who had been given the gift of sight again, of the thank you letter that had traveled such a long way before reaching her hands, and of the name she had discovered in the records of her new nurse. The entire church fell silent. Someone began to cry in the back pew, then someone else, and at the front, Grayson Calloway stood with tears running down his face, never once lifting a hand to hide them, never turning away, never concealing them from anyone. The man whose name had once made an entire city lower its voice stood crying in the middle of a church, for the first time since the day he had been a young boy in a hastily tailored suit, standing beside his father's coffin, while someone told him that a Calloway mustn't shed tears in front of strangers. Poppy left her place, ran to him, tugged at his sleeve, and offered him the small flower-embroidered handkerchief she always carried in her pocket. He bent down to take it, and it was a long moment before he could speak. When his turn came, he didn't read from the paper. He said that all his life, he had believed power meant making people afraid of him, and that he had become so good at it that he had forgotten anything else existed. Then he looked at Tessa and said that she had taught him that real power was creating a home where a child could dare to sleep peacefully. He promised to protect that, every day, for the rest of his life. Across the street from the church gates, an older man stood alone in a worn coat. He didn't cross the road, didn't enter the church, and didn't allow anyone to see him. When the wedding car passed, Cormac Calloway lowered his head and kept it bowed until the car disappeared, then turned and walked toward the end of the street. That afternoon, a photograph was taken in the garden beside the row of sunflowers that had grown taller than a person. In the picture, Maeve sat in a wicker chair. Poppy sat on the ground holding her doll. Grayson stood behind them, and Tessa stood in the center, the woman whom life had returned again and again. The woman who had once kept a cloth bag beside the door because she never knew when she might have to leave, now stood among 3 generations of a family that had chosen her. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths: that a person's worth isn't found in the uniform they wear or the balance in their bank account, but in the way they treat those who can offer them nothing in return. That dignity is sometimes the last possession a person has left, and when we preserve it, our children learn how to stand upright on their own, and that the kindness we give quietly is never lost. It simply travels a very long way before returning at the moment we need it most. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful stories. How do you feel about the story of Tessa and Grayson? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your heart. May everyone watching this video always be blessed with good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.